I mean, I recently, I think I did not start studying grief based on having personal experiences of having lost in that sense, as is quite often with this field. But a couple of years ago, I lost my father. And one of the things that struck me there was actually contemplating on the difference between the experience of being bereaved that my mother would have, and the experience of being bereaved that I would have in that sense. And I think what strikes me as particularly important here is whenever we want to or need to understand a grief process, we need to constantly ask the question, what did we lose? Not necessarily who did we lose, but what did we lose? Because in this case, both me and my mother lost the same person. He was my father, he was her husband. But what we lost was fundamentally different. So she did not only lose a person that she loved. That is important, and very often we talk to that when we frame grief and our understandings of grief. It's very much about the love of a person. And sometimes I think we forget that it's not only a person we lose an entire world in the process. So she would, for instance, lose, that person that she would lie next to in bed at night. She would be used to having the sound of his breathing as she would fall asleep, or in the morning she would wake up next to him. She would make coffee to him. They would sit and chit chat, and they would structure the day. She would, basically her entire habitual world was dependent on this person. That is not to say that my loss in that respect was not important, but it was completely different what I lost, right? So in that sense, what I lost was, for instance, it was the role of my father, and it was a keeper of my personal history, or aspects of myself that I do not know, but that he would have known about me, that I would be able to inquire about. Towards the end, I would say one of the conclusions that I've come to in terms of understanding what grief is, it's all about identity. Identity is perhaps one of the key markers here, right? So in that experience of losing somebody is not only losing a person you love, it's losing your very way of finding yourself in the world.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think that idea of the sort of the false idea, really, that I think is quite prevalent in our society, that grief is the loss of a person, and that's all it is. Obviously the loss of a person, is a profound thing, but I think that's so true. And I just reflecting on experiences of stillbirth or miscarriage, it's that idea of it's an identity, and it's also the future that you could have had or you would have had. So in that sense, the world that has been lost, and that makes much more sense of the type of bereavement that you have than thinking of it as a person and a relationship to a person as being the only or the fundamental thing. Madeline, I saw your request to please share the quote, so I'll put that in the chat in a minute. But just to explore a little bit more about this sense of the world being changed. When we discussed this previously, we talked about the poet and philosopher Denise Riley, and her writing and her poetry after the sudden death of her son, Jacob. And she also writes about this kind of altered condition of life. So she describes a curious sense of being pulled right outside of time. And that for the kind of 2 or 3 years after her son's death, that she really felt that time was stopped, or was kind of arrested in some sense. And I wondered if that was also something that you found in your research, and the way that people talk about how time itself changes when you've been bereaved.
Yeah, this is something I've been very preoccupied with, and I'm currently working on as well. But okay, quite a few people are working on that. But my take on it will be to place it under a broader heading of so when in the beginning, when we talked about an altered a feeling of being in the world, the very feeling of being in the world is different. I've tried to explore what that feeling is under the overall heading of kind of a world distancing. And again, let me just try and zoom in a little bit on what I'm getting at here, because again, when looking at the loss I experienced a couple of years ago, I think that to a large extent was confirmed these ideas that I was already working on. The most prevalent feeling I had in that respect was not necessarily a state of wanting to cry and shout and just some kind of intense yearning for the return of my father. What I actually think was most prevalent in the way I found myself was in a kind of retracted state. Like I felt like I was separated from everybody, separated from the world, separated from other people. And I clearly remember people coming up and paying their condolences to me, and I was like, oh, this is such a nice gesture, thank you for doing that, but actually it really doesn't matter right now to me. It might later on, but right now it's just I'm just cut off from everything, right? And that feeling was something that I've, in my research, where I have had a host of interviews with people who have suffered the loss of a loved one, and one of the things that struck me there was that they would tend to all use the same kind of metaphor for this state, which is a state of being in a bubble. People would express that as I don't know how that metaphor works in English actually, but that would be the kind of idiom they would use in Danish. But some other aspects of this would also pop up, like being behind a glass pane, or that there is I think C.S. Lewis, the English author, would describe something similar, saying that grief is that he's surprised how grief actually reminds him of being slightly drunk, or of having that there is some sort of carpet between oneself and the world. And overall, this state looks a lot like a kind of just a distancing phenomenon. So it manifests in time. We can get back to that, because I think there is a lot to go on there. But people will also explain this spatially, like for instance, being at afar from other people, like in the room, they would seem, things might seem further away, like. Really, not necessarily only in a metaphorical sense. Sensory impressions would not be as intense. What remained intense was the feeling, perhaps, of the love for the deceased. Like that was still there. That was intense, but everything else seemed a little bit zoned out, like being in a state of blur. And of course, so you could describe this state both in sensory terms as the world not being very intrusive, or in spatial terms as everything being slightly further, out of reach or far away. But they would definitely also explain it in their relation to other people, so that they would feel like strangers. Everybody, people they would used to feel close to, they would feel some sort of disconnection from them, like they were kind of a world apart, or like they were strange and otherworldly beings. So that natural kind of very penetrating closeness that we may have with other people and with our surroundings when we are very happy and thriving, or in a flow perhaps, that was all muffled up. That was all sort of placed at a distance. And in this respect, temporality is, of course, a key aspect. And this might sound very weird. It might sound very metaphysical. Sort of how could time, how might we understand somebody as falling out of time? That is what Denise Riley says. Like she feels ripped out of time. And I think one way of understanding this is to remember that there is a very big difference between clock time, the time that objective time that runs without any regard to how we are experiencing, and then our experience of time. And when you think about it, our experience of time is a very lively phenomenon. Sometimes time slows down, like people in depression would say how time would be completely slowed down. That's a very typical description. Sometimes time just runs, and you almost feel like you can't keep up. And in this respect, there is in grief, people would often describe some kind of a desynchronization, as simply as if they are no longer coupled with the time of the world. So this very intense thing happened to me. The person I loved more than life itself died, and the buses keep running, right? Mm-hmm. People still go to work, people still make their go grocery shopping and so on, as if nothing has happened. So that kind of I think one of the sources for this kind of disconnection that we are dealing with here is this desynchronization with the world, that you are in a different tempo. Everything is running smoothly as usual, but I am stuck here in a kind of a vacuum, frozen.